Well, to get a perspective of the significance of this particular visit by the Russian president, I've got two guests joining us this afternoon to take us through. First, Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU, joining us, and my colleague Amritpal Singh joining us from the newsroom. Let me first come to you, Professor Swaran Singh. How does one look at, or how does India-Russia relations, or the special status that India, both the countries hold, how does this move forward in the present world order?
Thank you, Anil. Russia is one of the great countries in the world, and so is India seen as emerging great power, and therefore the heads of the national leaders of two countries meeting makes a significant news, not just for their domestic audience, but also audience around the world. What is interesting here is that since their last face-to-face physical meeting in November 2019, indeed, President Putin has not traveled outside Russia. The only time he made that exception was to meet US President Joe Biden, and that too they met in Geneva, not in US. So in that sense, in spite of this new variant of COVID-19 emerging in last 2 weeks, a very short, hectic visit underlines the significance that Russia attaches today to India, where India is not just traditionally seen as a main defense partner and main destination for Russia's defense exports, but increasingly India has emerged as the major investor in China, and therefore I think the focus is now to expand the relationship from defense-centric to investments, economic relationship and partnerships, and you saw a series of agreements for joint production being signed during the meeting of two defense ministers. But I think it's also interesting for India because India has seen that in last decade or so, Russia has drifted gradually towards our immediate neighbor China, and India's China tensions growing up had required India to reconnect with Russia. And I think immediately Russia also becomes very significant for India's regional security after the NATO forces have precipitously left Afghanistan without organizing any stabilization or peace in Afghanistan. And in that sense, after exit of American and the NATO forces from Afghanistan in India's neighborhood, Russia has clearly emerged as one of the major players in ensuring some kind of inclusive government, some kind of engagement with Taliban, humanitarian aid and assistance being provided, which is partly driven by the fact that instability in Afghanistan directly impacts Russia's own Central Asia borders and Central Asian republics, which are part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which Russia leads. So basically, both sides had felt this enormous need to reconnect and reassure each side. Russia has its own concerns about India's proximity to United States. They have repeatedly showcased their displeasure and concern about India's engagement with quadrilateral security framework. So despite their having met few times in either BRICS online conferences or in RIC, this was an important event that both leaders could meet face to face physically and take each other's into confidence and explain things that may be of concern to the either side. And in that sense, I think it's fundamentally reinforcing the time-tested relationship of India and Russia, but also not just take a stock-taking kind of an assessment of what is happening, but how, as you just saw, the extension of their Intergovernmental Military Technical Cooperation Commission for next 10 years, how they see themselves, directing global trends and trajectories in coming decade or so. So it's in that sense a very significant meeting, not just for bilateral relationship, but also for ensuring regional security and contributing to the global, resilience of economy, or dealing with pandemic, or dealing with climate change. Several issues where Russia and India have important role to play, and their mutual understanding and I think certain kind of taking each other into confidence leaves a very significant symbolic message to not just their domestic audience, to the rest of the world. I'm sure people in Beijing, Washington, London, Brussels are carefully watching the body language and the language which is emerging out of this meeting today. And one should appreciate the fact that President Putin is making an effort. I think it's just a 6 or 7 hours visit to New Delhi, but he has made sure that he makes it possible and has a face-to-face meeting with Prime Minister Modi. And I think that is partly the showcasing of commitment that Russia has for India.
Okay. Okay, Professor Singh, when one looks at India's deepening defense ties, especially with Russia, how would, say, a Washington, a Beijing, for that matter, as Amrit put it, how would Kabul be looking at it?
I am sure I agree with the comment just made that it is interesting to see how the vision on how to stabilize, how to create inclusive government in Kabul is completely, similar when it comes to Russia's initiatives and vision
Okay.
of what they want to do in regard to stabilizing Afghanistan and what India wants to do in Afghanistan. So that kind of mutuality of their views is significant to highlight together. So I assume the joint statement you will see some of those sentiments of shared vision and shared view of how they want to stabilize and secure Afghanistan will be viewed. There is no doubt when it comes to Washington DC. Washington DC, you would have noticed that they have kind of focused far too much in dealing with Afghanistan through Pakistan or through Doha dialogue. But the kind of credibility which is today attached to the trilateral dialogues that Russia has been conducting, for example, of China, Pakistan, and Russia, and later, of course, in Pakistan, where sort of in India also NSAs met and Russian NSA was here in India. These are becoming far more credible and sort of respectable initiatives, especially so because the way United States and NATO forces left Afghanistan, they still continue to, subconsciously look at Taliban as an enemy, and therefore their approach and the kind of acceptability in Afghanistan is relatively still under question. So now India gradually, coming together in sort of talking to Russia. Iran is another country. India has very good relations with Iran. So these are immediate neighboring countries that find themselves directly sort of on the receiving end, and therefore their stakes cannot be misunderstood. And they are really getting far more credibility. And I think also last about a decade and a half, if you see reports coming out of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, had shown that about 20 years ago, 2/3 of India's defense equipment imports were from Russia and earlier Soviet Union, and they had gradually come down to less than 50% now. And that is primary export of Russia to India and to the rest of the world, and that's a main source of its foreign exchange earning. And therefore, Russia itself was keen on reactivating the links with India, and we have gradually clearly moved to not just license production here, but also of joint ventures and joint production. And the mention is being made now, for example, of helicopters, transport helicopters, light weapons like rifles, or BrahMos is a great example of their joint ventures. So in that sense, even defense cooperation over a period of time has moved from imports to licensed production to joint ventures. And in that sense, India is becoming a far more equal partner with Russia. And that would be noticed with Washington or other European capitals that have lately become kind of attractive destinations for India's defense equipment procurements. And you will notice that particularly when it comes to S-400 missiles, which we know now will be arriving, the first the set of missiles will be arriving before end of this month. And we have seen when similar missiles were imported by either China or Turkey, there's a law, CATSA, which is countering American adversaries through sanctions, that had led to slapping of sanctions on both China and Turkey. So it's interesting to see how India has managed to skirt its kind of gradual way of importing these missiles into India. And India being a major defense partner of United States will also have to very carefully calibrate whether they want to treat India in the same vein as they have treated Turkey and China. Would they slap sanctions on India or not? And in that sense, I think it's reviving the defense cooperation, which is kind of requirement for both sides. India needs to balance its defense cooperation with not just United States and its friends and allies, but also a traditional partner, Russia and earlier Soviet Union. So in that sense, India is trying to bring balance to its defense partnerships. India is trying to expand its relationship with Russia into investments. Energy will be a great kind of destination. Already, the kind of Far East area where India has invested about $15 billion cumulatively is the single largest destination of India's investments. And that has enormous potential. And now with Arctic opening up, enormous reservoir reserves of hydrocarbons and other very, very strategic minerals, iron ore, India is looking at that being, and as Prime Minister had said in his September online address to the Far Eastern Economic Forum, he saw this Eurasian Connect as Sangam with India's approach to the Indo-Pacific strategy. And India has been clearly engaged with Indo-Pacific. and India wants to see that connecting further to Eurasian continent. And in that sense, I think the Vladivostok area and Arctic becomes increasingly destinations of India's investments.
Okay.
Russia would definitely like that. Russia also would not like to put all eggs in one basket of China. So I think it's clearly a sense that was felt from both sides for quite some time. But here is an opportunity to really clinch some of the agreements. And I think more important is to kind of provide clarifications to each other, build trust and confidence, and give certain direction. And a joint statement, therefore, is going to be an interesting document to come out to showcase how these two leaders wish to see not just bilateral relations moving forward, but how they wish to together address many of the regional security issues or global issues. And in that sense, I think it's an important meeting which has slightly been delayed because of COVID-19. The last year meeting couldn't happen. But I think in that sense, the commitment from both sides is very clear, and the outcome is going to be clearly interesting.
Okay.